He believed he controlled everything, until he was saved by a child who emerged from the darkness of his own mansion. A fragile voice stopped him from climbing the staircase that would lead him straight to death. And it was by hearing someone no one else could see that he found what he never had: love, truth, and a new chance to live. If you were touched by this beautiful story of resilience and love, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. Continuing, the Manhattan skyline glittered against the darkening sky as Richard Blackwood's limousine glided through the rain-slicked streets. Another 14-hour day at Blackwood Enterprises had left him drained, his mind still churning with the faces of employees whose futures he had decided with the stroke of a pen. The quarterly downsizing had been particularly brutal, 300 jobs eliminated to maintain profit margins that would keep shareholders happy. "Home, sir," his driver announced as they approached the wrought-iron gates of his estate in the Hamptons. Richard nodded silently, gathering his leather briefcase. The massive gates parted automatically, recognizing the vehicle. As they rolled up the long driveway, his sprawling mansion came into view, 20,000 square feet of architectural brilliance that housed nothing but emptiness and echoes. "Will that be all for tonight, Mr. Blackwood?" the driver asked as the car stopped at the entrance. "Yes, thank you, Gerald. As usual, make sure security knows I'm not to be disturbed." Richard climbed the marble steps alone, punched in his security code, and entered the cavernous foyer. The household staff had already departed for the evening, another of his non-negotiable rules. Privacy, above all else. The sound of his Italian leather shoes echoed through the empty halls as he made his way to the grand staircase, loosening his tie. At 52, Richard Blackwood had amassed more wealth than most people could imagine. His technology conglomerate had revolutionized American industry, but the empire had come at a steep personal cost. 2 failed marriages, estrangement from his only brother, and a reputation as one of New York's most ruthless businessmen. The mansion, with its meticulously curated art collection and perfectly maintained gardens, felt more like a museum than a home. He was halfway up the marble staircase when a soft voice froze him in place. "Don't go up there, Mr. Blackwood." Richard spun around, nearly losing his balance. There, emerging from the shadows beneath the staircase, stood a small girl. She couldn't have been more than 11 or 12, with tangled brown hair and clothes that had seen better days. Her large eyes, an unusual shade of amber, held a disturbing intensity. "Who the hell are you? How did you get in here?" he demanded, his hand already reaching for his phone to call security. The girl shook her head urgently. "There's no time. Bad people are upstairs. They've been watching your house for days. They're looking for something, and they don't care if you're in the way." As if to confirm her warning, a crash echoed from the second floor, the unmistakable sound of glass shattering followed by heavy footsteps. Richard felt his blood run cold. The security system should have been impenetrable. "This way," the girl whispered, grabbing his hand with surprising strength. "I know a way out they won't find." Instinct took over, silencing the questions flooding his mind. Richard followed as she led him through the kitchen, past the pantry, and to a service door he rarely noticed. Outside, the rain had intensified, soaking them instantly as they sprinted across the manicured lawn toward a section of the property's stone wall partially concealed by overgrown ivy. "There's a gap here," the girl explained, pushing aside the vegetation to reveal a narrow opening. "The security cameras don't cover this spot." "How could you possibly know that?" Richard gasped, but followed her through the gap nonetheless. They emerged onto a quiet back road, where the girl continued to pull him along at a brisk pace, seemingly oblivious to the rain plastering her hair to her face. Richard's custom suit was ruined, his shoes sinking into mud with each step, but for the first time in decades his physical comfort was the least of his concerns. "Who are you?" he managed between labored breaths as they ducked into a small wooded area. "How do you know about my house?" "My name is Lily," she answered without slowing down. "Lily Anderson, and I know a lot about you, Mr. Blackwood. More than you might think." For the next hour they navigated through residential neighborhoods that grew progressively less affluent. The Hamptons estates gave way to middle-class communities, which in turn transitioned to older, more neglected areas. Finally, they reached what appeared to be an abandoned apartment building on the outskirts of town. Several windows were boarded up, and graffiti marked the exterior walls. "We'll be safe here for now," Lily said, leading him through a side entrance that had been carefully concealed to appear permanently sealed. Inside, Richard was surprised to find a small, makeshift living space. A mattress on the floor had been neatly made with clean but worn blankets. A plastic crate served as a table, holding a battery-powered lamp, some books, and a few meager possessions. The girl had clearly been living here for some time. "Sit down," she instructed, gesturing to the only chair in the room, a folding metal chair that had seen better days. "You're probably in shock," Richard obeyed, his mind still struggling to process the evening's events. "How did you know those people would be in my house tonight? Who are they? And why would you help me?" Lily's expression hardened, making her look much older than her years. "I've been watching your mansion for weeks. Not just me, those men have been too. They come at different times, take notes, photograph the place. I noticed the pattern. But why were you watching my house in the first place?" Richard pressed. The girl turned away, busying herself with retrieving a towel from a plastic bin. When she faced him again, her eyes held a mixture of pain and determination that made Richard's stomach tighten. "Because you destroyed my family, Mr. Blackwood." The accusation hung in the air between them. Richard stared at her, bewildered. "My dad was James Anderson. He worked in your financial department for 8 years. Last winter you fired him without warning or severance, claiming budget cuts. But he knew the real reason." The name stirred a vague recollection. There had been so many layoffs over the years, faces and names blurring together in service of the bottom line. "He tried to talk to you," Lily continued. "He had discovered something wrong with the company's books, numbers that didn't add up, money disappearing. But instead of listening, your company blacklisted him. No one would hire him after that. We lost our home, Mom got sick from the stress, and now—" Her voice trailed off. Richard noticed she was shivering, her clothes soaked through. Despite his confusion and the absurdity of the situation, he removed his wet but expensive jacket and offered it to her. "Why would you help me after all that?" he asked quietly. Lily accepted the jacket with a small nod. "Because what those men want is bigger than what happened to my family. Dad always said that despite everything, you weren't the real problem. There was something else going on, something he couldn't prove." "And where is your father now?" Richard asked, suddenly aware of the girl's apparent solitude. "He had to go into hiding after the threats started. He told me to stay with my aunt, but when I saw those men watching your house, I knew I had to do something. Dad left me a letter explaining where he hid evidence that could prove what's really happening at your company." Richard leaned forward, his business instincts kicking in despite the circumstances. "What evidence? What exactly did your father find?" "Financial records, emails, recorded conversations. He created a hidden compartment in the basement of your corporate headquarters before he was fired. No one knows about it except him, and now me and you." A chill that had nothing to do with his wet clothes ran down Richard's spine. If what the girl was saying was true, the implications were staggering. But one question remained unanswered. "These men who broke into my house, who are they working for?" Lily's amber eyes locked onto his. "That's what we need to find out." But Dad had a theory. He thought someone very close to you was behind everything. Someone who would benefit most if you were suddenly gone. The implication hung in the air between them. Richard felt his world tilting on its axis as possibilities raced through his mind. "We need to get those documents," Lily said with a determination that belied her young age. "And then we need to find my dad. He's the only one who can explain everything." As Richard stared at this child who had likely saved his life, this daughter of a man he had carelessly discarded, he felt something shift inside him. For the first time in longer than he could remember, the numbers, profits, and corporate maneuvering that had defined his existence seemed hollow and meaningless. "All right," he said, his voice firm with newfound resolve. "Where do we start?" Dawn broke over the abandoned building, casting long shadows through the cracks in the boarded windows. Richard awoke with a start, momentarily disoriented by his surroundings. His back ached from spending the night in the metal folding chair, and his once immaculate suit was wrinkled beyond salvation. Reality crashed back as he spotted Lily curled up on her mattress, still wearing his oversized jacket. The events of the previous night seemed surreal in the harsh morning light. Had he really fled his multi-million-dollar mansion because of a warning from a homeless child? Had his life actually been in danger? Or had he fallen victim to an elaborate scam? Lily stirred, immediately alert in the way that spoke of a life spent in constant vigilance. "You're still here," she observed, sounding mildly surprised. "Did you think I'd leave in the middle of the night?" Richard asked. She shrugged. "Most adults do what's best for themselves." The simple statement cut deeper than any boardroom barb ever had. Richard cleared his throat. We need a plan. I can't exactly walk into a police station looking like this and claim my house has been invaded without raising serious questions. We don't need the police, Lily said, rummaging through a plastic container and extracting a granola bar, which she broke in half and offered to Richard. We need those documents first. That's our leverage. Richard accepted the meager breakfast, suddenly aware of how long it had been since he'd eaten. You mentioned your father created a hiding place at Blackwood Tower. Getting in won't be difficult for me, but security cameras are everywhere. You'll need a disguise, Lily said matter-of-factly, and we'll need to go during the cleaning crew's shift between 7 and 10 p.m. Less people, less attention. You've thought this through, Richard remarked, increasingly impressed by the girl's resourcefulness. I've had time to observe, she replied. While you were in your big house, I was watching, learning patterns. It's how you survive when you have nothing. The words hung between them, heavy with accusation. Richard shifted uncomfortably. Lily, about your father, James, right? I need to understand exactly what happened. I sign off on departmental cuts, but individual terminations are handled by management. I don't remember the specifics of your father's case. Lily's expression hardened. That's convenient. Dad worked 70-hour weeks for your company. He was senior financial analyst, kept getting passed over for promotion even though he trained everyone who became his boss. Then one day, he noticed discrepancies in the financial reports. Large sums moving through shell companies reported profits that didn't match actual revenue. That's a serious accusation, Richard said carefully. It's not an accusation. It's what happened. Lily stood up, suddenly seeming taller than her small frame should allow. He gathered evidence for months, documented everything. When he finally took it to his supervisor, he was fired the next day, escorted out by security. Corporate said it was downsizing, but Dad knew better. Richard frowned. If what you're saying is true, why didn't he go to the authorities? He tried, but whoever was behind it was powerful enough to block him at every turn. The evidence disappeared from his home office. His laptop was stolen. Then the threats started. Lily's voice wavered slightly. Anonymous calls. Strange cars parked outside our house. Dad sent me to stay with my aunt while he went to gather the backup evidence he'd hidden at Blackwood Tower. That was 3 weeks ago. And your mother? Richard asked gently. She left 2 years ago. Couldn't handle Dad's dedication to his job. Ironic, right? Lily laughed without humor. He sacrificed his marriage for your company, and this is how they repaid him. Richard processed this information, his mind racing. If true, this suggested corruption at the highest levels of his company, potentially including his most trusted executives. My father always said you probably didn't know, Lily continued, her tone softening slightly. He said you were too focused on expansion and acquisition to notice what was happening in your own backyard. He didn't hate you, Mr. Blackwood. He pitied you. The words stung more than Richard would have expected. The image of himself as the all-knowing CEO suddenly seemed like a hollow facade. Why did you really save me last night, Lily? The truth. The girl's amber eyes met his unflinchingly. Because those men weren't just after documents. They were there to make it look like you had an accident. Dad's notes mentioned it as a possibility if things went south. And if you disappeared, whoever's behind this would get away with everything. Richard felt a chill run through him. You think someone wants me out of the picture permanently. I think someone close to you has been stealing millions and would do anything to keep it quiet. She paused. And I need you alive to help me find my dad. Their unlikely alliance crystallized in that moment. A billionaire CEO and a homeless child, both seeking truth for entirely different reasons. We'll need supplies, Richard said, his decision made. Clothes, food, cash. I can't use my credit cards or they'll track us. I know a place where we can get some of that, Lily replied. There's a church community center a few blocks from here. They help people in need without asking too many questions. Richard nodded, though the prospect of accepting charity made him deeply uncomfortable. After that, we'll need to find a way to get to Blackwood Tower without being recognized. I might have an idea about that too, Lily said, a hint of a smile playing at her lips for the first time. But you're not going to like it. 2 hours later, Richard stood in the bathroom of the community center, barely recognizing his reflection. His trademark silver hair had been dyed a nondescript brown, his clean-shaven face now hidden behind a scraggly beard, applied with spirit gum from a theater makeup kit Lily had somehow procured. Gone was his tailored suit, replaced by oversized jeans, a flannel shirt, and a worn jacket. He looked like any middle-aged man down on his luck, invisible to the kind of people who would normally court his attention. Not bad, Lily appraised as he emerged. She herself had cleaned up, her hair now neatly braided, wearing clean clothes donated by the center. No one would ever guess you're worth billions. I'm not sure I am anymore, Richard muttered. If my house has been compromised, my accounts might be next. That's why we need those documents, Lily reminded him. Once we have proof, we can figure out who's behind this and why. As they left the community center, Richard felt strangely liberated. For the first time in decades, no one was watching him, expecting things from him or trying to impress him. On the streets of New York, he was just another face in the crowd, and it was oddly refreshing. There's something I don't understand, Richard said as they walked toward the subway station. If your father suspected someone was embezzling from Blackwood Enterprises, why create a hiding place inside the very building controlled by the people he was investigating? Lily smiled. Because sometimes the safest place to hide is right under your enemy's nose. Dad was smart. He discovered an old maintenance tunnel during renovations that wasn't on any of the updated blueprints. The perfect hiding spot. And you're sure you can find this tunnel? Richard asked skeptically. Dad left detailed instructions in case something happened to him. I've memorized them. Lily tapped her temple. I knew they might come in handy someday. As they descended into the subway, Richard felt a strange sense of déjà vu. The last time he'd taken public transportation had been during his college years, before his first startup had taken off. Now surrounded by the everyday New Yorkers, whose lives continued unaffected by stock fluctuations and corporate takeovers, he felt an odd connection to a world he'd left behind long ago. We'll transfer at Union Square, Lily explained with the confidence of someone far beyond her years. Then take the local uptown. It'll drop us 3 blocks from Blackwood Tower. We should arrive just as the evening cleaning crew starts their shift. How do you know so much about the building's schedule? Richard asked. Dad made sure I understood everything about your company. He said knowledge was our only protection. She hesitated before adding, he also said that if anything happened to him, I should find a way to talk to you directly. He believed that underneath everything, you were a good man who'd been surrounded by the wrong people. Richard wasn't sure how to respond. Was he a good man? The question had never factored into his business decisions. Effectiveness, efficiency, profitability, those were the metrics that mattered. Yet here was this child who had saved him despite having every reason to hate him, looking at him with an expectation that he couldn't quite define. As the subway car rattled through the tunnels beneath Manhattan, Richard Blackwood found himself facing a reality he'd never contemplated. His entire empire might be built on corruption. He'd been too consumed with expansion to notice. His life had been threatened in his own home, and his only ally was the daughter of a man whose life he had carelessly upended. We're going to find your father, Lily, he said quietly, and we're going to get to the bottom of this. I promise you that. For the first time, Lily's carefully maintained composure cracked slightly, revealing the vulnerable child beneath. I hope so, Mr. Blackwood. He's all I have left. As the train emerged briefly from underground, the gleaming spire of Blackwood Tower was visible in the distance, a monument to Richard's success that now seemed more like a fortress they needed to infiltrate. Whatever secrets lay hidden in its depths, Richard was determined to uncover them, regardless of where the truth might lead. Blackwood Tower dominated the Manhattan skyline, its gleaming glass exterior reflecting the setting sun, like a monument to corporate success. From the small coffee shop across the street, Richard observed the building that bore his name with newfound wariness. Employees streamed out through the revolving doors, heading home after another day of furthering his vision, or so he had always believed. The cleaning crew arrives at 7:15, Lily said, stirring her hot chocolate. Despite her mature demeanor, the childish delight she'd shown when Richard had offered to buy her the drink had been a stark reminder of her actual age. They use the service entrance on the east side. That's our way in. There will still be people working late, Richard noted. Executives, ambitious junior staff trying to impress their bosses. That's why your disguise is important, Lily replied. No one looks twice at maintenance workers. They're invisible. Richard considered this. How many times had he passed the cleaning staff in his building without a single glance? They existed in his peripheral vision at most, part of the infrastructure rather than individuals with lives and stories. Even with this disguise, there's a risk someone will recognize me, he said. That's why I'm coming with you, Lily stated matter-of-factly. A kid with an adult worker will throw people off. They'll assume you're bringing your daughter to work because of childcare issues. People make up stories in their heads that make sense to them. Richard raised an eyebrow, impressed by her strategic thinking. "You've really thought of everything." "I had to," she said simply. "Now we need to go over Dad's instructions one more time." As Lily recited the directions to the hidden maintenance tunnel with perfect recall, Richard found himself wondering about the kind of man James Anderson must be. To have raised such an intelligent, resourceful daughter under what must have been incredibly difficult circumstances spoke to an extraordinary character, the kind of person Richard typically surrounded himself with professionally, but rarely connected with personally. At precisely 7:10 p.m., they left the coffee shop and crossed the street, timing their arrival to coincide with the cleaning crew. Lily had fashioned a makeshift ID badge that would pass cursory inspection, hanging from Richard's jacket pocket. "Remember, maintenance workers don't make eye contact with executives," Lily whispered as they approached the service entrance. "Keep your head down, look tired but purposeful." Richard nodded, feeling an unfamiliar nervousness. He'd given speeches to thousands, negotiated billion-dollar deals, and faced hostile takeover attempts without breaking a sweat. Yet here, trying to sneak into his own building, his heart raced like a teenager breaking curfew. They fell in step behind a group of cleaning staff, Lily clutching Richard's hand in a convincing display of father-daughter dynamics. The security guard at the service entrance barely glanced at them, waving the group through after checking the first few badges. Inside, Richard fought the urge to look around furtively. The service corridors were utilitarian and stark, a sharp contrast to the marble and mahogany he typically traversed. The cleaning staff dispersed to their assigned floors, while Richard and Lily headed toward the basement level. "This way," Lily murmured, guiding him toward a service elevator. "We need to go to sub-level 3. That's where the old maintenance tunnels connect." The elevator required a key card, which momentarily stalled their progress until an actual maintenance worker approached. "Forgot my card," Richard explained with a self-deprecating smile, gesturing to Lily. "Daycare closed early and the wife's working late." The man gave a sympathetic nod. "Been there, buddy. Corporate doesn't care about our family situations, do they?" He swiped his card, holding the door for them. "Sub-level 3. Not much down there except old archives and mechanical rooms." "Busted pipe in the northeast corner," Richard improvised. "Been leaking into the electrical conduits. Gonna be a long night." The maintenance worker grimaced. "Rather you than me, pal. Good luck with that." As the elevator descended, Lily squeezed Richard's hand, a silent acknowledgement of his quick thinking. When the doors opened to sub-level 3, they found themselves in a dimly lit corridor with exposed pipes running along the ceiling. "Not exactly the executive floor, is it?" Richard commented as they stepped out. "This building has 17 layers of security for the executive suites," Lily replied, "but only basic access control for maintenance areas. Dad said that's always how it works. All the protection facing one direction, blind spots in the other." They navigated through a maze of corridors, Lily confidently leading the way, based on her memorized instructions. The farther they went, the older the infrastructure appeared, transitioning from modern construction to sections that clearly predated the current tower. "This building was constructed on the foundation of an older office complex from the 1960s, Richard explained, feeling a strange need to defend his building's haphazard design. Some of the original substructure was incorporated to save costs. "That's what made Dad's hiding place possible," Lily said. "Here, this should be it." They stood before what appeared to be a blank concrete wall with an old electrical panel mounted to one side. Lily approached the panel and carefully removed its cover, revealing not circuit breakers, but a small lever concealed behind the facade. "Clever," Richard murmured, genuinely impressed. Lily pulled the lever, and with a soft grinding noise, a section of the concrete wall slid aside just enough to allow passage. Beyond lay a narrow maintenance tunnel, dimly lit by emergency lighting that cast everything in an eerie red glow. "How did your father even find this place?" Richard asked as they squeezed through the opening. "He said he was looking for somewhere to eat lunch in peace," Lily explained, "away from office politics and gossip. He discovered this by accident when he was exploring the building during breaks." The tunnel stretched before them, curving gently out of sight. The air was stale but not unpleasant, suggesting some connection to the building's ventilation system. "Dad's hiding place should be about 30 meters ahead," Lily said. He described it as being behind a section of wall with a small red mark. They proceeded cautiously, their footsteps echoing slightly in the confined space. Richard found himself wondering about James Anderson with growing curiosity. The man had worked in his company for years, Yet Richard couldn't recall his face. Just another name on an organizational chart, another salary on a spreadsheet. Now, he was following this man's carefully laid breadcrumbs, trusting in the foresight of someone he'd discarded without a second thought. There, Lily pointed to a small, innocuous red X barely visible on the concrete. This is it. Following her instructions, Richard pressed on a specific section of the wall. A small panel popped open, revealing a cavity behind. Inside was a waterproof document case and a portable hard drive, carefully wrapped in protective material. He said there would be a letter, Lily said anxiously, her composure finally showing cracks as the reality of their mission hit home. Richard carefully extracted the items and opened the document case. Inside, along with numerous files and papers, was an envelope with "For Lily" written on it in neat handwriting. He handed it to her with a gentleness that surprised even himself. Lily's hands trembled slightly as she opened the letter, her eyes scanning the contents rapidly. "He's at a cabin in the Catskills," she announced, relief evident in her voice. "He says it's safe there, and he's been gathering more evidence." "What about these documents?" Richard asked, carefully examining the rest of the case's contents. His eyes widened as he began to understand what he was seeing. "These are internal financial records, wire transfers, offshore account details." His voice trailed off as the implications became clear. "Dad said it was big," Lily affirmed. "Systematic embezzlement going back years. Tens of millions redirected through shell companies and dummy accounts." Richard spread the documents on the floor of the tunnel, his business mind automatically analyzing the patterns. The transactions were cleverly disguised as legitimate business expenses, vendor payments and consulting fees. But when viewed together, they revealed a sophisticated scheme to siphon money from Blackwood Enterprises into private accounts. This level of access, these authorizations, Richard's blood ran cold as he recognized the signature pattern. These could only have been approved by someone with executive-level clearance, someone who knows all our internal controls and security protocols. "Dad's letter mentioned a name," Lily said quietly, still clutching the paper. "He said the person behind everything is—" A noise from the tunnel entrance interrupted her. Footsteps, multiple sets, approaching quickly. "We need to go," Richard whispered urgently, gathering the documents and hard drive. "Is there another way out?" Lily nodded, pointing further down the tunnel. "Dad mentioned an emergency exit that connects to the parking garage. This way." They hurried deeper into the tunnel, the sound of pursuers growing louder behind them. Richard's mind raced. How had they been discovered? Who knew about this hidden passage? The answers pointed to an uncomfortable conclusion. Someone very close to him was not only aware of their movements, but actively working against them. The tunnel forked, and Lily hesitated momentarily before choosing the right path. The emergency lighting flickered ominously, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for them like grasping fingers. "Who's back there?" Richard whispered as they ran. "I don't know," Lily replied, "but if they know about this tunnel, they're connected to whoever's been stealing from your company." They reached a metal door marked with a faded exit sign. Richard pushed it open cautiously, revealing a dimly lit section of the underground parking garage reserved for executive vehicles. "Stay close," he instructed, leading Lily between the rows of luxury cars. Most belonged to his senior management team, people he'd trusted implicitly for years. Now, he viewed each nameplate with suspicion. They had nearly reached the garage exit when a voice called out from behind them. "Richard, is that you?" Richard froze, instantly recognizing the voice. He turned slowly to face Thomas Blackwood, his younger brother and the company's chief financial officer, standing near his Porsche with a confused expression. "My God, what happened to you?" Thomas asked, approaching them. "Security's been going crazy. Your house was broken into, you disappeared, everyone's been looking for you." His gaze shifted to Lily. "And who's this?" Richard instinctively moved Lily behind him, his mind working furiously. Thomas had always been the more personable of the Blackwood brothers, handling the company's public relations while Richard focused on strategy and growth. They'd drifted apart over the years, their relationship becoming more professional than fraternal. "Thomas," Richard acknowledged cautiously. "What are you doing here so late?" "Emergency board meeting about your disappearance," Thomas explained, still eyeing Richard's disguise with bewilderment. "Richard, what the hell is going on? You look like a homeless person. You're sneaking around with a child in the parking garage." "I can explain everything," Richard said, measuring his words carefully. "But not here. It's complicated and possibly dangerous." Thomas's expression shifted from confusion to concern. Dangerous? Richard, you're scaring me. Whatever's happening, I can help. We're family. The sincerity in his brother's voice was convincing. Richard hesitated, torn between his instinct to trust his only living relative and the damning evidence in the document case. Mr. Blackwood, Lily whispered urgently, tugging at his sleeve. We need to go. Thomas's attention focused fully on Lily now. Who is she, Richard? What have you gotten yourself into? Before Richard could respond, the parking garage door they had exited from burst open. Two men in dark suits emerged, scanning the area intently. We need to leave. Now. Richard grabbed Lily's hand and turned toward the exit. Wait, Thomas called after them. My car is right here. I can get you out safely. Whatever trouble you're in, Richard, I want to help. Richard hesitated, years of brotherhood warring with newfound suspicion. The decision he made in that moment would determine everything that followed. Thomas, he said finally, I need to know I can trust you. Of course you can, Thomas replied without hesitation. You're my brother. Richard locked eyes with his brother, searching for any sign of deception. Finding none, he made his choice. Thomas's Porsche sped through the night, leaving the Manhattan skyline behind as they crossed the George Washington Bridge into New Jersey. Richard sat in the passenger seat, the document case clutched tightly on his lap, while Lily huddled in the back, her eyes never leaving Thomas. You still haven't told me what's going on, Thomas said, breaking the tense silence. First you disappear, then I find you disguised in our parking garage with a child and men chasing you. The board is in panic mode, Richard. They're talking about invoking the emergency succession clause. Richard studied his brother's profile in the dim light of the dashboard. Thomas had always been the more approachable Blackwood, charming where Richard was reserved, personable where Richard was calculating. Their different approaches had made them an effective leadership team, with Richard driving strategy and Thomas managing relationships. Someone broke into my home last night, Richard finally said. Lily warned me just in time. Thomas glanced in the rearview mirror at the girl. And who exactly is Lily? My name is Lily Anderson, she answered before Richard could. My father worked for Blackwood Enterprises until he was unfairly terminated last winter. Recognition flickered across Thomas's face. Anderson, James Anderson, from Financial Analysis. You remember him? Richard asked, surprised. Of course. Brilliant analyst, but he started making wild accusations about financial irregularities. Thomas shook his head. HR recommended termination after he became increasingly paranoid and confrontational. I signed off on it myself. Lily leaned forward. He wasn't paranoid. He discovered someone was stealing from the company, and they silenced him. Thomas frowned, glancing at Richard. And you believe this? Richard patted the document case. I've seen evidence that's hard to dismiss. Systematic embezzlement, Thomas. Millions funneled through shell companies, falsified vendor contracts, manipulated expense reports, all requiring executive-level authorization. That's impossible, Thomas declared. Our financial controls are airtight. I personally oversee the audit committee, which would make you perfectly positioned to bypass those controls, Lily said quietly. The car swerved slightly as Thomas's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Excuse me? Are you accusing me of embezzlement? Lily, Richard warned, though the same thought had crossed his mind. Where exactly are we going, Mr. Blackwood? She pressed, ignoring Richard's caution. A safe house I maintain in the Palisades, Thomas answered, his voice tight. Somewhere we can talk privately and figure this out. He turned to Richard. I can't believe you're entertaining these accusations. We're brothers, Richard. When have I ever given you reason to doubt me? The hurt in Thomas's voice seemed genuine, making Richard second-guess his suspicions. They had drifted apart over the years, their relationship becoming more professional than personal, but Thomas had always been loyal to the company. I need to understand what's happening, Richard said carefully. Someone tried to eliminate me last night. The only person who would significantly benefit from my removal is my successor, which is me, Thomas acknowledged grimly. I see where this is going, but if I wanted control of the company, there are a dozen legal ways I could have challenged you. Why would I resort to violence? It was a fair question. Despite their differences in management style, Thomas had never shown any desire to usurp Richard's position. He seemed content with his role managing the company's finances and public image. My dad's letter mentioned a name, Lily interjected. He said, "We'll discuss everything at the safe house," Richard interrupted, giving her a warning look. Until he was certain of Thomas's innocence, it was better to keep some information in reserve. They exited the highway and wound through increasingly secluded roads, eventually turning onto a private drive that led to a modern cabin overlooking the Hudson River. The property was hidden from the main road by dense trees, offering both privacy and a strategic vantage point. "Few people know about this place," Thomas explained as he parked. "I come here when I need to escape the city and think." Inside, the cabin was surprisingly modest, given Thomas's usual taste for luxury. A spacious living area with a stone fireplace open to a kitchen and dining space. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered spectacular views of the river below. "Make yourselves comfortable," Thomas said, moving to the kitchen. "You both look like you could use some food. I'll see what I have." Richard placed the document case on the dining table, keeping it within reach. "This is nice, Thomas. I didn't know you had this place." "There's a lot we don't know about each other anymore, Richard," Thomas replied as he rummaged through the refrigerator. "When was the last time we had a conversation that wasn't about quarterly projections or board approvals?" The question hung in the air, uncomfortably accurate. When had the Blackwood brothers become merely business associates? Richard couldn't remember. "I could use a shower," he said, changing the subject. "This disguise is starting to itch." Thomas nodded. "Bathroom's down the hall. I'll find you some clean clothes." Once Richard had left, Thomas turned his attention to Lily, who remained vigilant near the door. "You don't trust me," he observed. "I don't know you," she replied evenly. "Fair enough." Thomas set a plate of cheese and crackers on the counter. "But I'm curious, why did you warn my brother about the intruders? If your father was wrongfully terminated, wouldn't it be easier to let Richard face the consequences?" Lily approached cautiously, taking a cracker. "My dad always said the problem wasn't Richard. He said the real corruption was hidden from him deliberately." "Your father sounds like a man of integrity," Thomas remarked. "Rare in our industry." "He is," Lily affirmed. "And he's in hiding because he tried to expose the truth." Thomas's expression softened. "You must miss him very much." For the first time, Lily's composure wavered. "Every day. We'll find him," Thomas promised. "If what you're saying is true, then your father deserves justice, and so do you." The sincerity in his voice caught Lily off guard. She studied him carefully, trying to reconcile this seemingly compassionate man with her suspicions. Richard returned, his face clean-shaven again, and dressed in clothes that were slightly too small for his frame, but a vast improvement over his disguise. "That's better," he sighed, running a hand through his now visible silver hair. "Thomas, we need to talk about these documents." "Of course," Thomas agreed, bringing coffee to the table. "Show me what you found." Richard opened the case and spread out the financial records. Fake vendors receiving payments for non-existent services, shell companies with connections to offshore accounts, consulting fees for consultants who never consulted, all hidden within legitimate transactions, buried under layers of accounting misdirection. Thomas examined the documents with a furrowed brow. "This is concerning. But Richard, anyone with financial access could have created these transactions. It doesn't prove executive involvement." "Look at the authorization patterns," Richard countered, pointing to several signatures. "These required C-level approval. The only people with that level of access are you, me, Patricia from legal, and Edward from operations." "And I can't imagine Patricia or Edward being involved," Thomas mused. "They've been with us since the beginning." "Exactly," Richard said grimly. "Which leaves us." The brothers stared at each other across the table, decades of shared history suddenly overshadowed by suspicion. "I didn't do this, Richard," Thomas said quietly, "and I know you didn't either. There must be another explanation." Lily, who had been silently examining the documents, suddenly pointed to a recurring notation. "What does Midas stand for?" "It appears on multiple transactions." Thomas leaned forward. "It's our internal code for the Middle East and Asian Development Subsidiary, a holding company for our international ventures." "It also spells Sadim backwards," Lily observed. "Dad mentioned that in his letter. He said it was significant somehow." Richard frowned. "Sadim. Why does that sound familiar?" "It's the opposite of Midas," Thomas explained. "In Greek mythology, King Midas turned everything he touched to gold. Sadim would be the reverse, turning gold into something worthless. Or siphoning money away," Richard muttered. "Clever. Hidden in plain sight." Thomas reached for his laptop. "Let me check something." His fingers flew across the keyboard as he accessed the company's secure financial database. My DAS projects have been under Edward's oversight since we expanded into Dubai 3 years ago. Edward Jenkins? Richard's eyebrows rose. He's been with us for 15 years, one of our most trusted executives. And he has signing authority on these accounts, Thomas confirmed, turning the screen to show Richard. Plus, he's been pushing for that succession plan I mentioned, arguing that your leadership style is too cautious for today's market. Richard absorbed this revelation. Edward had always been ambitious, but Richard had channeled that ambition for the company's benefit. Had he misjudged the man so completely? We need more than suspicion, Richard said finally. We need concrete proof that Edward is behind this. The hard drive, Lily reminded him. Dad said it contains recordings. Richard extracted the portable drive from the case and connected it to Thomas's laptop. The device contained dozens of audio files, meticulously labeled by date. He selected one at random and pressed play. A voice they all recognized as Edward Jenkins filled the room. The old man suspects nothing. Keep the transfers under $5 million per quarter, and he'll never notice. By the time the auditors might catch on, we'll have implemented the succession plan. Another voice responded, a voice that made Richard's blood run cold. And if he starts asking questions before then we accelerate the timeline, Edward replied. The accident scenario we discussed. Tragic but clean. Richard stopped the recording, his face ashen. That second voice, Thomas nodded grimly. Patricia Lewis, our chief legal officer. Dad was right, Lily whispered. It goes all the way to the top. Richard slumped back in his chair, the betrayal hitting him like a physical blow. Patricia had been one of his first hires, a brilliant attorney who had helped build Blackwood Enterprises from a struggling startup into a corporate giant. Edward had joined later, bringing international experience that had proven invaluable during their expansion. They've been planning this for years, Thomas said, his voice tight with anger. Using our trust against us. But why now, Richard wondered. What's changed that made them decide to move against me? Thomas hesitated, then sighed heavily. The Artemis project. Your clean energy initiative is set to redirect billions in investment away from our traditional technology sectors where Edward and Patricia have built their power bases. So this is about money and power, Richard said bitterly. Isn't it always? We need to contact the authorities, Thomas insisted. With these recordings and financial records, there's more than enough evidence for criminal charges. Not yet, Richard cautioned. Edward and Patricia have connections throughout the industry, possibly including law enforcement. We need to be strategic. He turned to Lily. Your father's letter mentioned he's hiding in the Catskills. Lily nodded. A cabin near Woodstock. He said he's gathered additional evidence there. Then that's where we need to go next, Richard decided. James Anderson may be the key to unraveling this entire conspiracy. Thomas looked troubled. Richard, it's too dangerous. These people have already tried to eliminate you once. They won't hesitate to try again. I don't have a choice, Richard replied firmly. This is my company, my responsibility. I let this happen under my watch because I was too focused on expansion to notice the corruption festering within. Then I'm coming with you, Thomas declared. We started Blackwood Enterprises together, and we'll defend it together. Richard felt a surge of gratitude for his brother, a reminder of the bond they'd shared before business had come between them. Thank you, Thomas. Lily cleared her throat. We should leave soon. If they found us at Blackwood Tower, they might track us here too. The girl's right, Thomas agreed. We should move quickly. I'll pack supplies for the trip. As Thomas disappeared into another room, Lily moved closer to Richard. Can we really trust him? She whispered. My dad's letter didn't mention him specifically, but Thomas and I have our differences, Richard replied quietly. But he's my brother. If I can't trust him, I can't trust anyone. Lily didn't look convinced, but she nodded reluctantly. I just want to find my dad and make sure he's safe. And we will, Richard promised. First thing tomorrow, we head to the Catskills. As the night deepened around the cabin, Richard found himself staring out at the Hudson River, its dark waters reflecting the distant lights of New York City. Somewhere in that glittering skyline stood Blackwood Tower, the physical manifestation of everything he'd achieved, and everything he stood to lose. The realization that had been forming since his flight from the mansion finally crystallized. Richard Blackwood, for all his wealth and power, had built an empire of glass, beautiful but fragile, transparent yet distorting. And now the stones were already in the air, thrown by those he had trusted most. Dawn broke over the Hudson Valley, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold as Thomas's SUV wound its way through the Catskill Mountains. They had abandoned the Porsche at a train station parking lot and switched to Thomas's less conspicuous vehicle, stored in a private garage under a different name, one of many precautions the younger Blackwood had apparently established over the years. "You've prepared for something like this," Richard observed from the passenger seat, watching as his brother navigated the mountain roads with practiced ease. "The safe house, the backup vehicle, the burner phones. This isn't improvisation." Thomas kept his eyes on the road. "Not for this specifically, but yes, I've always maintained contingency plans. One of us needed to think about worst-case scenarios while you were focused on best-case opportunities." The subtle criticism wasn't lost on Richard. Throughout their business relationship, Thomas had often advocated for more caution, more safeguards, while Richard pushed for aggressive expansion. Richard had usually prevailed, and the company had grown exponentially as a result, but perhaps at a cost he was only now beginning to understand. In the back seat, Lily dozed fitfully, exhaustion finally overcoming her vigilance. Even in sleep, her brow remained furrowed as if she couldn't escape the weight of her concerns. "She's an extraordinary child," Thomas remarked, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. "To have endured what she has and still maintain such resilience." Richard nodded. "Makes you wonder what kind of man James Anderson is, to have raised a daughter like that on his own." "We'll find out soon enough," Thomas replied. "Assuming he's still at this cabin." The uncertainty hung between them as they continued their journey, climbing higher into the mountains. According to Lily's directions, James Anderson's hideout was a remote cabin accessed by a fire road several miles from the nearest town. "Richard," Thomas said after a long silence, "I need to know what you're planning once we find Anderson and consolidate the evidence. Are you thinking prosecution? A quiet internal cleanup? Or something else entirely?" It was a good question, one Richard had been pondering throughout the night. Justice needs to be served. Edward and Patricia betrayed not just me but everyone at Blackwood Enterprises. They were willing to destroy lives for their own gain. "I agree," Thomas said carefully, "but a public scandal could devastate the company. Stock prices would plummet, clients would flee, thousands of innocent employees would suffer. So we should cover it up," Richard challenged. "Become complicit ourselves?" "Not cover up but control," Thomas clarified. "Handle it strategically. Force their resignations, recover the stolen funds, implement new safeguards, and move forward stronger than before." It was the pragmatic approach, the kind of solution that protected the institution over the individual. The old Richard would have agreed without hesitation. But the events of the past 2 days had shifted something fundamental within him. "I don't know if I can do that anymore," Richard admitted. "Not after seeing what happened to James Anderson and his daughter. They deserved justice, and I failed them. How many others have been sacrificed for the good of the company?" Thomas shot him a concerned look. "This isn't like you, Richard. You've always understood that leadership requires difficult choices." "Maybe that's the problem," Richard replied quietly. "Maybe I've been making the wrong choices all along." Before Thomas could respond, Lily stirred in the back seat. "Are we there yet?" she asked, sitting up and rubbing her eyes. "Almost," Thomas assured her. "Can you check the directions again?" Lily pulled out the letter from her father, reviewing his instructions. "After the covered bridge, there should be an unmarked dirt road on the left. The cabin is about 2 miles in." The covered bridge appeared around the next bend, a picturesque wooden structure spanning a rushing mountain stream. Thomas slowed the SUV, carefully scanning for the turnoff. The unmarked road was easy to miss, little more than a gap in the dense forest vegetation. "There," Lily pointed, suddenly fully alert. "That's it." Thomas turned onto the rough track, the SUV bouncing over ruts and rocks. The forest closed in around them, branches occasionally scraping against the windows. After about 20 minutes of slow progress, the trees thinned, revealing a small clearing with a rustic cabin nestled against the mountainside. "That's it," Lily whispered, her voice tight with emotion. "That's where Dad is." Richard studied the cabin carefully. No vehicles were visible, and no smoke rose from the chimney despite the morning chill. The place had an abandoned feel that made him uneasy. "Wait here," Thomas said, reaching under his seat and extracting a handgun. Richard stared at the weapon in shock. "Since when do you carry a gun?" "Since our company became the target of corporate espionage 3 years ago," Thomas replied grimly. "Another precaution you dismissed as unnecessary." Before Richard could respond, Thomas was out of the vehicle, approaching the cabin with the practiced caution of someone with tactical training. Another side of his brother Richard had never bothered to discover. Lily couldn't wait any longer. She unbuckled her seatbelt and bolted from the car, racing toward the cabin. "Dad!" she called out. "Dad, it's me! Lily, wait!" Richard scrambled after her, cursing under his breath. Thomas reached the porch first, motioning for them to stay back as he tried the door. Finding it unlocked, he pushed it open cautiously, gun at the ready. "James Anderson," he called out. "My name is Thomas Blackwood. We're here with your daughter, Lily." No response came from within. Thomas disappeared into the cabin, emerging moments later with a troubled expression. "It's clear, but it looks like someone left in a hurry. There's food on the table, papers scattered everywhere." Lily pushed past him into the cabin, her eyes scanning frantically for any sign of her father. Richard followed, taking in the humble interior. A single main room served as kitchen, dining, and living area, with 2 doors presumably leading to bedrooms. The walls were covered with maps, newspaper clippings, and financial documents connected by red string, the work of someone trying to piece together a complex puzzle. "He was here," Lily said, picking up a coffee mug with still warm liquid inside. "Recently." Thomas examined the papers on the table. "These are more financial records, similar to what we already found, but more detailed. Looks like he's traced the money trail to several offshore accounts." Richard moved to the wall of evidence, studying James Anderson's investigation. It was meticulous, comprehensive, the work of a brilliant analytical mind. Anderson had connected dots that Richard, for all his business acumen, had completely missed. "Dad?" Lily called, moving toward one of the bedroom doors. "Are you here?" She pushed open the door and gasped. Richard rushed to her side, afraid of what she might have found, but the room was empty of people. Instead, a laptop sat open on the bed, its screen displaying a paused video recording. On the bedside table lay a handwritten note addressed to Lily. With trembling hands, she picked it up and read aloud. "Lily, if you're reading this, I've had to leave quickly. They found me somehow. Don't worry, I'm safe, but I need to keep moving. The final evidence is on this computer, the complete money trail and recorded conversations proving everything. There's someone else involved, someone whose name I didn't include in my previous messages because I wasn't certain until now. Trust no one except Richard Blackwood himself. He was never part of this. I love you. Stay strong. Dad." Lily looked up, her eyes filled with fear and determination. "We need to see what's on that laptop." Richard nodded, moving to the bed. He pressed play on the video, and James Anderson's face filled the screen. The man looked exhausted but resolute, mid-40s with Lily's same amber eyes and a beard that had grown wild during his time in hiding. "Mr. Blackwood," he began, looking directly into the camera, "if you're watching this, then Lily found you as I instructed her to do in case of emergency. First, thank you for protecting my daughter. She's all that matters to me." Richard felt a strange sense of shame. This man, whom he couldn't have picked out of a lineup days ago, had trusted him with his most precious treasure. Anderson continued, "What you've discovered so far is only part of the conspiracy. The embezzlement scheme extends beyond Edward Jenkins and Patricia Lewis. They're just the operational arm. The architect behind everything, the person who stands to gain the most, is someone much closer to you." A chill ran down Richard's spine as he glanced at Thomas, who was watching the video with an unreadable expression. 3 years ago," Anderson continued, "your brother Thomas approached me privately. He said he had concerns about financial irregularities and asked me to investigate discreetly. I believed him at first, even admired his apparent integrity. But as I dug deeper, I realized the irregularities all led back to accounts he controlled. When I confronted him, he offered me a choice: join their scheme for a percentage or lose everything. I refused." The room seemed to freeze. Richard stared at the screen, then slowly turned to Thomas, whose face had hardened into a mask. "That's a lie," Thomas said flatly. "Anderson was terminated for erratic behavior and making unfounded accusations. This is his revenge fantasy." On screen, Anderson anticipated the denial. "Thomas will claim I'm lying, that I was unstable or seeking revenge, but the evidence speaks for itself. The final proof is in an encrypted file on this computer. The password is Lily's birthday followed by sunrise, our special word." Anderson's voice softened. "Lily, if you're watching, remember what I always told you. The truth is like the sunrise. No matter how dark the night, it always comes eventually." Lily was already moving to the laptop, typing in the password. A folder opened, containing dozens of files meticulously organized and labeled. "He's desperate," Thomas insisted, his voice rising, a disgruntled ex-employee trying to shift blame. "Richard, you know me. We built this company together." Richard said nothing, watching as Lily opened a video file. The screen showed Thomas in his office, speaking with Edward Jenkins. The timestamp indicated it was from 2 years ago. "Anderson is becoming a problem," Thomas was saying on the recording. "He's digging into the Midas transfers." "Should we terminate him?" Edward asked. Thomas shook his head. "Not yet. Let's move him to the Singapore project first, away from the main accounts. If he continues to be troublesome, then we'll eliminate his position during the next restructuring." Lily opened another file, an audio recording of Thomas speaking with Patricia Lewis about accelerating the timeline regarding Richard. "My brother has served his purpose," Thomas's voice declared coldly. "Blackwood Enterprises needs new leadership for the next phase. More aggressive, more adaptive. Richard's too attached to his ethical boundaries." "And the board?" Patricia asked. "Half of them are already in my corner," Thomas replied. "The others will fall in line once Richard is indisposed. The succession plan is already drafted." Richard felt physically ill. Each piece of evidence was more damning than the last, painting a picture of systematic betrayal spanning years. His brother, his own flesh and blood, had been orchestrating his downfall while smiling to his face. "Enough," Thomas suddenly growled. Richard turned to find the gun pointed directly at him. "I tried to do this the easy way, Richard. Bring you to a remote location, stage an unfortunate accident. A grieving brother assumes control of the company. Clean, simple. Was any of it real?" Richard asked, his voice hollow. "Our brotherhood, the company we built together?" "Parts of it," Thomas admitted, an eerie calmness settling over him. "I respected your vision, your drive. But you were always so righteous, so unwilling to seize certain opportunities. Do you know how much money we left on the table because of your ethical concerns? Billions, Richard, all because you couldn't see the bigger picture. And that justified betraying me, planning my elimination?" "Business isn't personal," Thomas replied with a shrug. "It's evolution. The company needs to evolve past your limitations." During this exchange, Lily had been quietly working at the laptop, her fingers flying across the keyboard. Thomas noticed too late as she pressed a final key with triumph. "What did you do?" he demanded, swinging the gun toward her. "Sent everything to the cloud," she answered defiantly. "All of it. Dad taught me how to create dead man switches. If anything happens to us, this evidence goes to the FBI, the SEC, and every major news outlet automatically." Thomas's face contorted with rage. "You little—" "It's over, Thomas," Richard interrupted, stepping between his brother and Lily. "You've lost. Even if you eliminate us, you can't eliminate the truth." For a tense moment, Thomas looked capable of anything, the gun trembling in his hand. Then suddenly the sound of vehicles approaching broke the standoff. Through the cabin window, they could see several SUVs pulling into the clearing. "That's not possible," Thomas muttered, momentarily distracted. "No one knew we were coming here." Richard seized the opportunity, lunging forward and grappling for the gun. They struggled briefly before Richard managed to wrest the weapon away, backing up to keep Thomas at bay. "Who did you call?" Thomas demanded, his eyes wild. "No one," Richard replied truthfully, "but it seems James Anderson had his own contingency plans." The vehicles outside bore the insignia of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Agents emerged, weapons drawn, surrounding the cabin. "Thomas Blackwood," a voice announced over a loudspeaker. "This is the FBI. We have the cabin surrounded. Come out with your hands up." Thomas looked at Richard, something like regret finally crossing his features. "It didn't have to end this way, brother." "No," Richard agreed quietly. "You could have chosen differently." "We both could have." As the agents moved in to apprehend Thomas, Richard put his arm around Lily's shoulders, sheltering her from the chaos. Through the confusion, a familiar figure emerged from one of the vehicles, a man with amber eyes and a wild beard, rushing toward the cabin with single-minded purpose. "Dad!" Lily broke free from Richard's grasp, running outside into her father's waiting arms. Richard watched their reunion through the cabin window, witnessing a bond of love and trust that made his own family's betrayal all the more painful. As Thomas was led away in handcuffs, their eyes met one final time, brother to brother, across a gulf that could never be bridged again. In that moment, Richard Blackwood understood that some losses could never be measured in dollars and cents, and some gains, like the tearful reunion happening outside, were worth more than all the wealth he had ever accumulated. The federal safe house outside Albany was a far cry from Richard's Hampton estate or Thomas's riverside cabin, modest furnishings, functional rather than luxurious, and windows with views of nothing in particular. Yet as Richard sat at the kitchen table sipping mediocre coffee, he felt strangely at peace for the first time in days. Across from him, James Anderson, now freshly shaven and dressed in clean clothes provided by the FBI, was explaining the intricate details of how he had uncovered the conspiracy. The first red flag was a discrepancy in the Asian development funds, James explained, his finger tracing patterns on a financial spreadsheet. Amounts that didn't match between initial appropriations and final expenditures. Most people wouldn't notice because the differences were hidden across multiple subsidiary accounts. Richard nodded, impressed despite himself. "And you tracked these discrepancies for how long?" "About 18 months, James replied. "At first I thought they were accounting errors, but the pattern was too consistent, too careful. When I expanded my search, I found similar discrepancies dating back nearly 5 years. In the adjacent living room, Lily sat with FBI Special Agent Diana Reynolds, who had been assigned to protect them while the investigation unfolded. The agent was showing Lily how to dust for fingerprints, an impromptu forensic science lesson that had the girl completely engrossed. "She's resilient," Richard observed, watching Lily laugh at something Agent Reynolds said. "After everything she's been through." James's expression softened as he looked at his daughter. "Kids are stronger than we give them credit for, but she shouldn't have had to be this strong. She deserved a normal childhood, not—" He gestured vaguely. "All this. I'm sorry," Richard said quietly. "For what it's worth, I never knew what Thomas was doing, but that doesn't absolve me. It happened under my watch to your family, and probably others." James studied him for a moment. "You know, I never blamed you personally. Your brother made sure you were insulated from the financial details, surrounded by people loyal to him. The perfect figurehead CEO, the visionary who didn't bother with the mundane operations." The assessment stung, but Richard couldn't deny its accuracy. He had always focused on the big picture, delegating the details to others. That distance, that willful ignorance, had created the perfect environment for corruption to flourish. "What happens now?" Richard asked, more to himself than to James. "The FBI says Thomas is cooperating," James replied, "offering information on Edward, Patricia, and the others involved in exchange for consideration during sentencing. Classic first-mover advantage in the prisoner's dilemma." "Always the strategist," Richard muttered bitterly. Even now. Agent Reynolds entered the kitchen, her expression professionally neutral. "Mr. Blackwood, the U.S. Attorney would like to speak with you. She's on her way here now." Richard nodded, steeling himself for the conversation ahead. The legal implications of what had happened at Blackwood Enterprises were still unfolding, with potential charges ranging from securities fraud to conspiracy and embezzlement. While he hadn't been involved in the scheme, questions about his oversight responsibilities remained. An hour later, U.S. Attorney Vivian Martinez arrived, a formidable woman whose reputation for prosecuting white-collar crime preceded her. She dispensed with pleasantries, laying out the situation with clinical precision. "Your brother has implicated 6 other executives in the scheme," she explained, arranging documents on the table. Together, they embezzled approximately $94 million over 5 years. The money was laundered through shell companies in the Cayman Islands, Singapore, and Dubai before being redistributed to private accounts. "And Thomas was the mastermind?" Richard asked, still struggling to reconcile this reality with the brother he thought he knew. "According to both the evidence and his own admission, yes," Martinez confirmed. "He cultivated allies in key positions, particularly in finance and legal, where oversight was most critical." "What about my responsibility in all this?" Richard asked directly. "I was CEO. This happened on my watch." Martinez regarded him carefully. "That's partly why I'm here, Mr. Blackwood. There are serious questions about your oversight or lack thereof. While we've found no evidence of your direct involvement, negligence at your level can still carry significant penalties." "I understand," Richard said quietly. "However," Martinez continued, "Mr. Anderson's testimony about your brother's deliberate efforts to keep you uninformed has been corroborated by other witnesses. And your cooperation since discovering the fraud has been noted." James, who had been silently observing, finally spoke up. "Richard isn't just cooperating. He's the one who helped connect the final pieces that made this case possible. Without him, My evidence might never have reached you. Martinez nodded acknowledgement. Which brings me to a proposal. Blackwood Enterprises is facing a crisis. When news of this fraud becomes public, and it will, the company's stock will plummet. Thousands of employees could lose their jobs, pension funds will take massive hits, and the ripple effects could impact the broader tech sector. I'm aware of the potential fallout, Richard said grimly. The Justice Department believes it would be in the public interest to minimize that collateral damage, Martinez explained. We're prepared to offer you a deal, Mr. Blackwood. In exchange for your full cooperation in the prosecution of all involved parties and the implementation of comprehensive corporate reforms, we would not pursue charges against you personally. Richard processed this offer, aware of the scrutiny from both Martinez and James. And the condition is that I remain as CEO to stabilize the company during the transition. Precisely, Martinez confirmed. With court-appointed oversight, of course. Your expertise and public reputation could help the company survive this crisis, protecting jobs and investments, while the guilty parties are prosecuted. It was a pragmatic solution, one that addressed the practical realities while still pursuing justice. The old Richard would have accepted immediately, recognizing the business logic. But Richard found himself hesitating. I appreciate the offer, he said carefully, but I need to consider whether I'm the right person to lead the company forward. My failure to detect this fraud suggests that perhaps someone else would be better suited to implement these reforms. Martinez seemed surprised by his reluctance. Take the evening to consider your options, Mr. Blackwood. We'll need your answer by morning. After she departed, Richard stepped outside onto the safe house's small porch, needing fresh air and perspective. The autumn sun was setting over distant hills, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. He heard the door open behind him and turned to find James joining him. Quite the view, James remarked, leaning against the railing. Different from the corner office, but maybe better in some ways. Richard nodded, appreciating the man's attempt at casual conversation. James, I want to thank you for what you did. The risks you took, the price you paid, it was more than anyone should have to endure. I didn't do it to be thanked, James replied simply. I did it because it was right. Still, I owe you more than I can ever repay. Your job, your home, these past months of separation from Lily, all because you tried to expose the truth about my company. James considered this. Maybe there is a way you can repay that debt, though not to me personally. Name it, Richard said without hesitation. Take the deal, James urged. Stay as CEO, but be a different kind of leader. The kind who sees people, not just profits. The kind who builds a company culture where someone like me wouldn't have to risk everything to expose wrongdoing. Richard was struck by the absence of bitterness in the man's voice. After everything James had endured, he was still thinking about the greater good, about all the employees and families whose livelihoods depended on Blackwood Enterprises. I'm not sure I know how to be that kind of leader, Richard admitted. I think you do, James countered. I've watched you these past few days. The Richard Blackwood who fled his mansion with my daughter, who risked everything to uncover the truth, who faced his own brother's betrayal with dignity, that's someone who could rebuild Blackwood Enterprises into something better than it was before. Their conversation was interrupted by Lily, who emerged from the house with Agent Reynolds. Dad, Richard, look, she exclaimed, holding up a piece of paper. Agent Reynolds helped me make a perfect fingerprint chart. The adults dutifully admired her work, and Richard was struck by how quickly the girl had bounced back from the trauma of recent events. Children's resilience was indeed remarkable, but it shouldn't be necessary, as James had said. She deserved a normal childhood, not one defined by corporate intrigue and safe houses. Later that evening, after Lily had gone to bed, Richard found himself unable to sleep. The U.S. Attorney's offer weighed heavily on his mind, along with James's unexpected endorsement. Restless, he wandered into the kitchen for water and found Agent Reynolds at the table, reviewing case files. Can't sleep, Mr. Blackwood? She asked, closing the folder she'd been examining. Too much on my mind, he admitted. Agent Reynolds, you've seen cases like this before. What typically happens to the company afterward? She considered the question. It varies. Some recover with new leadership and stricter controls. Others never regain public trust and eventually collapse or get acquired for pennies on the dollar. She paused. The difference often comes down to how transparently the company handles the crisis and whether the response feels authentic or just like damage control. And what makes a response feel authentic? Richard asked. Accountability. she replied without hesitation. Real consequences, real changes, real commitment to doing better. People can forgive mistakes, even terrible ones, if they believe the remorse is genuine and the commitment to change is real. Her words resonated with something forming in Richard's mind, the outline of a path forward that felt neither like surrender nor like the same old corporate maneuvering he'd engaged in for decades. "Thank you, Agent Reynolds," he said sincerely. "You've helped clarify something important." The next morning, U.S. Attorney Martinez returned for his answer. Richard was ready, having spent most of the night formulating his response and the plan that would accompany it. "I'll accept your offer," he began, "but with some modifications of my own." Martinez raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening." "I'll remain as CEO through the crisis and initial reorganization, but only for a transitional period of 1 year," Richard explained. "During that time, I'll implement comprehensive reforms, cooperate fully with all investigations, and prepare the company for new leadership." "And after the year?" Martinez asked. "I'll step down permanently," Richard stated firmly. "New leadership, unconnected to the past, will take Blackwood Enterprises forward." Martinez studied him curiously. "That's an unusual counteroffer, Mr. Blackwood. Most executives in your position fight to maintain control." "I'm not most executives," Richard replied. "At least not anymore." After further discussion of details and conditions, Martinez agreed to his terms. As she prepared to leave, Richard added one final request. "There's a position I'd like to create immediately," he said. "Chief Ethics Officer, reporting directly to the board and with oversight of all financial operations, and I have someone specific in mind for the role." Martinez followed his gaze to where James Anderson sat with Lily, helping her with a puzzle. "Interesting choice," she commented, "but potentially very effective." That afternoon, when Richard approached James with the offer, the former financial analyst was skeptical. "You want me to come back to the company that fired me?" he asked incredulously. "I want you to help me rebuild it into the kind of company that would never fire someone for doing what you did," Richard clarified. "Complete autonomy, board-level authority, and a mandate to create systems that make integrity the foundation of everything we do." James glanced at Lily, who was watching their conversation with interest. "And what about my daughter? This past year has been hell for her. She needs stability, normalcy." "That's part of the package," Richard assured him. "A new home near the best schools, flexible working arrangements, whatever support you both need." He paused. "James, I can't undo what happened to you and Lily, but I can try to make sure it never happens to anyone else." After a long moment of consideration, James extended his hand. "All right, Mr. Blackwood. Let's see if we can turn this ship around." As they shook hands, Richard felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders, not the familiar burden of corporate leadership, but something more meaningful, a commitment not just to shareholders and bottom lines, but to people and principles. Across the room, Lily caught his eye and gave him a small, knowing smile, as if she had expected this outcome all along. Perhaps she had seen something in him that night in his mansion that he hadn't yet recognized in himself, the capacity for change, for growth, for becoming something more than the sum of his achievements and acquisitions. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Richard Blackwood felt not like a CEO, but like a human being finding his way back to what truly mattered. 1 year later, Richard Blackwood stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office, watching a spring rainstorm wash over Manhattan. Blackwood Tower still dominated the skyline, but what happened inside its walls had transformed dramatically over the past 12 months. The changes had begun with the press conference, a brutally honest admission of the corruption that had flourished under his leadership. Rather than the carefully scripted, legally sanitized statement his crisis management team had prepared, Richard had spoken from the heart. He had taken responsibility, outlined the reforms he would implement, and promised that those harmed would be made whole. Most surprisingly to the assembled media, he had announced his intention to step down once the company was stabilized. "Mr. Blackwood," his assistant's voice came through the intercom. "They're ready for you in the boardroom." "Thank you, Clara. I'll be right there." Richard gathered the leather portfolio containing his final report as CEO. Today would be his last board meeting, the culmination of the most challenging and rewarding year of his professional life. Despite initial predictions of collapse, Blackwood Enterprises had not only survived the scandal, but emerged stronger. The stock price, after an initial plummet, had gradually recovered as investor confidence returned. More importantly, The company culture had undergone a fundamental shift. He walked through the executive floor, nodding to employees who no longer averted their eyes in his presence. The fear-based deference of the past had been replaced by genuine respect, hard-earned through actions, not position. Richard passed the glass-walled office of James Anderson, now Chief Ethics Officer, who was deep in conversation with his team. James caught his eye and gave him a thumbs up. The boardroom fell silent as Richard entered. Many of the faces around the table were new. The scandal had necessitated a near-complete overhaul of the board. The remaining few had proven their integrity through rigorous vetting. "Good morning," Richard greeted them, taking his place at the head of the table one final time. "As you know, today marks the completion of my commitment to guide Blackwood Enterprises through its restructuring period and to prepare it for new leadership." He distributed copies of his final report, a comprehensive document detailing the reforms implemented over the past year. The new ethics framework developed by James Anderson, the transparent financial reporting systems, the whistleblower protections, the employee profit-sharing program, and the corporate governance changes that would prevent any future concentration of power. "Thank you all for being here for this transition meeting. I believe we have fulfilled every promise made to our shareholders, employees, and the public," Richard continued. "Blackwood Enterprises stands ready for its next chapter under the leadership of Dr. Sarah Chen." He nodded to the brilliant technologist the board had recruited from academia, a woman with impeccable credentials, a strong ethical foundation, and a vision for how technology could serve humanity rather than merely generating profit. "Thank you, Richard," Dr. Chen said, her voice carrying the quiet confidence that had impressed the board during the selection process. "The foundation you've rebuilt is strong. I look forward to building upon it." The meeting proceeded efficiently through the formal transition procedures. When the final documents had been signed, Board Chair Eleanor Winters presented Richard with a small crystal plaque, a simple thank you for his service, absent the usual grandiose tributes typical of corporate departures. "I believe I speak for everyone when I say that your leadership this past year has been transformative," Eleanor said. "You could have fought the allegations, dragged the company through years of legal battles, or simply walked away. Instead, you stayed and did the hard work of genuine reform. That legacy will endure long after today." Richard accepted the plaque with a nod of appreciation. "Thank you, but this was never about my legacy. It was about making things right, as much as they could be made right." After final handshakes and well wishes, Richard left the boardroom for the last time. Instead of returning to his office, he took the elevator down to the lobby. As the doors opened, he was surprised to find James and Lily Anderson waiting for him. "Ambush," James said with a grin. "We figured you might try to sneak out without saying goodbye." Richard smiled. Over the past year, his relationship with the Andersons had evolved from awkward professional alliance to genuine friendship. He had watched James flourish in his role as ethics chief, bringing an outsider's perspective and a whistleblower's vigilance to the position. And Lily, no longer the frightened girl from that rainy night, had blossomed in her new school, excelling academically while slowly reclaiming the childhood that circumstances had threatened to steal from her. "Not goodbye," Richard corrected. "Just a change in office location. The foundation isn't going to run itself." The Blackwood Foundation for Corporate Accountability had been Richard's focus for the past 6 months, his vision for what would come after his time as CEO. Funded with a significant portion of his personal fortune, the foundation would advocate for corporate ethics, support whistleblowers, and provide resources for companies seeking to implement meaningful reforms. "Are we still on for dinner Saturday?" Lily asked. At 12, she had retained her remarkable maturity while regaining a child's enthusiasm for life. "Dad's making his famous lasagna." "Wouldn't miss it," Richard promised. Their weekly dinners had become a cherished ritual, a reminder of what truly mattered beyond balance sheets and board meetings. As they walked through the lobby together, Richard reflected on how much had changed since that night, when a small girl had emerged from the shadows to warn him of danger. He had lost his company, his brother, and the life he had built over decades. Yet somehow he had gained something far more valuable, a sense of purpose beyond accumulation, and connections based on genuine care rather than utility. Thomas was serving a reduced sentence in exchange for his cooperation in prosecuting Edward Patricia and the others involved in the scheme. Richard had visited him once in prison. A stilted conversation that had revealed the gulf between them had always been wider than he'd realized. Perhaps someday reconciliation might be possible, But for now, Richard had accepted that some bridges couldn't be rebuilt. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the city washed clean and glistening in the afternoon sun. James headed back inside for a meeting, while Lily walked with Richard to the street corner. "So how does it feel?" she asked, as they waited for the light to change. "Not being CEO anymore?" Richard considered the question. "Lighter," he finally said. "Like I've set down something heavy I've been carrying for too long." Lily nodded sagely. "Dad says sometimes we don't realize how heavy something is until we put it down." "Your dad is a wise man," Richard agreed. "Are you scared?" she pressed, with the directness only children and very good friends can get away with. "About what comes next?" Richard smiled at her perceptiveness. "A little. I've been defined by Blackwood Enterprises for so long that I'm not entirely sure who Richard Blackwood is without it." "I know who you are," Lily said confidently. "You're the man who listened when everyone else ignored us. You're the man who chose to do what was right instead of what was easy. You're the man who's coming to dinner on Saturday because you promised, not because there's anything in it for you." Her simple assessment moved him more than any corporate accolade ever had. "When did you get so wise?" he asked, only half joking. "I've had good teachers," she replied with a shrug. "Both what to do and what not to do." The light changed, and they prepared to part ways, Lily back to school, Richard to the temporary offices of his new foundation. "Oh, I almost forgot," Lily said, reaching into her backpack. She pulled out a small, crudely wrapped package. "I made this in art class. For your new office." Richard carefully unwrapped the gift to find a small clay sculpture, a simple figure of a man standing straight and tall. "It's you," she explained unnecessarily, "standing on your own 2 feet." He blinked rapidly, unexpectedly moved by the thoughtful gift. "It's perfect, Lily." "Thank you." They said their goodbyes, and Richard watched her skip back toward the tower entrance, where James would meet her after school. Her resilience continued to amaze him, her ability to move forward without forgetting the past, to find joy despite difficult experiences. As Richard turned to walk downtown toward his new beginning, he cradled Lily's sculpture carefully in his hands. It was a simple thing, made with more enthusiasm than skill, yet it represented something profound. A new foundation, built not on wealth or power or status, but on integrity and human connection. His phone buzzed with a text message from Dr. Chen. "Transition complete. The company is officially in new hands. Thank you for your trust." Richard typed a quick reply. "The company is in the right hands." "That makes all the difference," before slipping the phone back into his pocket. Ahead lay uncertainty, the unfamiliar terrain of a life defined by purpose rather than position. Behind was the tower that still bore his name, but was no longer his responsibility. For a moment, he allowed himself to look back, to acknowledge the empire he had built and the price he had paid for it. Then he turned forward again toward whatever came next. The path ahead was uncharted, but for the first time in decades, Richard Blackwood walked it as a free man, unburdened by secrets, unbeholden to shareholders, guided by nothing but his own rediscovered conscience. 6 months later, Richard stood at the podium in the conference hall of the newly established Blackwood Foundation for Corporate Accountability. The audience before him represented a cross-section of corporate America, executives seeking guidance on ethical leadership, former whistleblowers sharing their experiences, journalists covering the growing movement for corporate reform, and students preparing to enter the business world with a different set of values than his generation had held. "True success," Richard told them, "isn't measured in stock prices or market capitalization. It's measured in lives improved, in trust earned, in doing right even when it costs you something." He gestured to James Anderson, who sat in the front row beside Lily. "I learned this lesson the hard way, from people who had the courage to stand for truth when I was too busy building empires to notice what really mattered." After his speech, during the reception, Richard found himself approached by a young business student from NYU. "Mr. Blackwood," the student began hesitantly, "my ethics professor says your case represents the rare instance of genuine corporate redemption. But I'm curious, do you ever miss it? The power, the wealth, the influence you had?" Richard considered the question carefully. "I miss certain aspects," he admitted. "The thrill of building something, the satisfaction of solving complex problems. But I've discovered something interesting about influence. When it's based on fear or position, it's limited and temporary. When it's based on integrity and example, it's boundless and enduring." Across the room, he caught sight of Lily showing Dr. Chen her latest science project, something involving sustainable energy that the girl had become passionate about over the past year. The former CEO and the current one listened intently to the enthusiastic 12-year-old, treating her ideas with the seriousness they deserved. The scene embodied everything Richard had come to value: genuine connection, mutual respect, and the transfer of wisdom across generations. Not the legacy he had once envisioned for himself, but infinitely more meaningful. Later that evening, as he walked home to his new apartment, comfortable but modest compared to his former mansion, Richard reflected on how completely his definition of success had transformed. The man who had once measured his worth in acquisitions and assets now found his richest rewards in Saturday dinners with the Andersons, in mentoring young entrepreneurs committed to ethical business practices, and in the simple knowledge that he was, at last, using his talents for something larger than self-aggrandizement. His phone chimed with a message from Lily. "Dad says to remind you about fishing this weekend. Don't forget your lucky hat this time." Richard smiled, typing back a confirmation. The monthly fishing trips with James and Lily had become another cherished tradition. Quiet days by the lake where conversations meandered, where past and future were discussed with equal openness, where three people who had been brought together by corporate intrigue had forged a bond that transcended their unlikely beginning. As he reached his building, Richard paused to look up at the night sky, something he'd rarely done in his previous life of perpetual motion and achievement. A few stars were visible despite the city lights, steady and constant in their ancient patterns. In that moment, Richard Blackwood felt something that had eluded him throughout his years of wealth and power: contentment. Not the restless satisfaction of goals achieved and immediately replaced with new ambitions, but the deep, quiet peace of being exactly where he was meant to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. The empire of glass he had built had shattered, but from its fragments he had crafted something far more precious: a life of meaning, connection, and integrity. And that, he now understood, was the true measure of a successful life.